Hello, everybody. Happy Halloween. Welcome to a webinar that we're doing through the Equity Initiative here at the League of American Bicyclists on the topic of equitable bike advocacy and the invisible cyclist. I am Adonia Lugo. I'm the Equity Initiative Manager here, and I am joined today by four really cool voices on this subject. We've got Steve Zavistosky, who is a sociology professor at the University of San Francisco. We have Do Lee, who is with Biking Public Project in New York City. We have Eric Huerta, who is with Multicultural Communities for Mobility in Los Angeles, and Naja Shakir of Boston Bikes. So I'm going to go ahead and let Steve give an intro, and we'll go around and hear from the others too.
Great. Hi, everybody. Yeah, as Adonia said, my name is Steve Zavistosky. I'm in the Department of Sociology at the University of San Francisco, and that's what my training is in. I'm also affiliated with the Environmental Studies program. So I've been a lifelong cyclist of all sorts of stripes, really. And I wanted to mention as well that in my Department of Sociology, we have 10 full-time faculty, and one of the things I'm most proud of is that I'm the only heterosexual white male of those 10. So I actually feel like I have the ability to, check my privilege. I know it's not always a popular term, but my training as a sociologist and then being a member of a department that's as diverse as it is, we can have some pretty honest and open conversations. So I hope I can play that role today. Also, as a white male, I come at this from having done everything from triathlons and mountain biking to, like I said, being a lifelong bicycle commuter, bicycle touring, cyclocross racing, all the kinds of things that you think of, that sort of fearless white male doing. But I'm also a member of the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition and Bike East Bay. I live in the East Bay, so that's my local bike coalition. And I've kind of woven together in the last few years my work as an academic and my love for bicycling and advocacy. I'll stop there. I think that kind of covers my background.
Great. Okay, Do, why don't you tell us about yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Adonia. My name is Do Lee. I'm a PhD student in environmental psychology at the City University of New York, and I'm also work with the Biking Public Project, as Adonia mentioned. So my work is to study the lived experience of bicycling, and this includes the spaces of social justice and inclusion and exclusion within the bicycling movement and within the sustainable city. So right now I'm working with the Biking Public Project as a volunteer, and we're working on a project to design a participatory action research project with food delivery cyclists here in New York City who are often Asian and Latino immigrants. And so the basic idea of this project is to rethink the traditional ways in which the power dynamics of research is conducted, and to really understand the lived experience of the food delivery cyclists from their perspective, and how we can maybe rethink how we plan and design bicycling infrastructure that actually meets their needs instead of requiring them to be educated in the infrastructure in the way that we do it from a privileged perspective. And so as for me on a personal level, I actually came to bicycling fairly recently, last few years. I grew up in California as a driver, and now I've been kind of moving towards more bicycle commuting and really making that a much bigger part of my life, and trying to understand what that means for me as well.
Great, Do. Thanks. Okay, Eric, let's hear about your connection to bicycling and what you do in LA.
Hi, everybody. Again, this is Eric. I am a part of Multicultural Communities for Mobility. MCM advocates for safe alternative transportation access to underserved communities of color within the greater Los Angeles area. I've been a part of MCM since their inception a few years ago when they were known as City Lights. And basically through the work of MCM and my own, being an undocumented immigrant, I'm a cyclist by choice. It's my number one mode of transportation and here in LA, aside from public transport. So, it was naturally for me to go from advocating for immigrant rights and other issues to move into cycling and pedestrian issues, which is something that I live on a daily basis. So with MCM and a bunch of friends that I ride with all the time, we do this kind of work. We do workshops, we do safety workshops, we do fun rides, or we do mural rides. We tie it into political issues that are happening in the community. So everything from gentrification to police violence, stuff that's happening in the neighborhood. And just this last week, we had a conversation in the community on whether bike lanes lead to gentrification within like certain communities. So we're always up to something, and we're always doing something. And yeah, I'm just happy to be here.
Great, thanks, Eric. Okay, last but not least, Naja, tell us.
Hi, everyone. I work at Boston Bikes, and we do everything bike-related in the city of Boston, from installing infrastructure to conducting our annual bike counts, installing bike racks, everything that's done from a normal city level. Personally, I've been a lifelong cyclist. I grew up in a community of cyclists. I once tried to bike across the United States, then got bored, so I only made it across about New Hampshire and Vermont. It's always been a part of my life. So as someone who happened to be a cyclist and then entered the world of bike planning, I think a lot of the things we discuss, like saying alternative transportation, they don't necessarily make sense to me because it's always been my transportation, and I just struggle with dealing with those terms and mean and how they help to move us forward.
Great. All right. Well, I am so glad that you guys all agreed to participate in this discussion today. I really appreciate it. And for the audience, we will be taking questions in the chat box of the webinar if you're connecting through a computer. Now, we may not have time to get to questions. We'll see if our speakers have a lot to say on this subject. If we don't get to questions during the webinar, we're going to go ahead and answer them over. We'll have an email discussion answering them, and then I'll post that on the League's blog to share out. You can also send us questions or tweet at any of us on Twitter. The hashtag we're using is bikes4all. 4 is the number 4, and I've put up all of our Twitter handles on a slide here if you're not viewing the screen, so you can get in touch with us. So I think to get started, we want to just kind of find out what the term invisible cyclist means from our different speakers' perspectives. And I'm just going to go in reverse order now and ask Naja first, what is your take on this term? When did you first encounter it? You know, what does it work? Does it not work for you?
Adonia knows this. I first heard the term from Adonia. And I was shocked and appalled to hear it come out of her mouth, because it's nothing positive to me. For me, it's an excuse to justify continued exclusion of people, and to call someone invisible, I feel like takes away the blame from planners for not including those people. Because if they're invisible, then it's not the planner's fault for being unable to see them. So when I grew up in North Philadelphia, and everyone had a bicycle. Children would frequently ride bikes meant for 6-foot-tall grown men. The house on the corner was a drug house, but it was also full of bicycles. So my whole world is probably what would fit into what people mean when they say invisible cyclist. And since that is my whole view of cycling and how I was born and raised, I can't connect with the term, and I can't find anything positive in it.
Great, and I'll add that Naja was actually really polite. She didn't outright tell me that she thought it was a ridiculous term when she heard me say it. She waited until I came to her and said, you know, I don't think this is a really great term to use, and she went, yeah. I really agree with you, actually. Yeah, so thanks for that. All right, Eric, tell us what you think about the invisible cyclist term.
I was more familiar with it in terms of like the spaces I was in, and I'm sort of still in. Because when I first heard like invisible cyclist, I was like, oh yeah, you know, I'm undocumented immigrant. I'm riding my bike. Yeah, like, you know, and then it kind of went into like the kind of other rhetoric that I'm used to hearing, being in immigrant rights and organizing spaces. So I was like, yeah, I'm an invisible cyclist because, you know, technically I don't count in, and then it's only now, like, with, like, all my friends that are urban planners and we're talking all this bike quality stuff that, like, I'm hearing more about it in terms of, like, where everybody else is hearing about it in terms of, like, not being counted in infrastructure or, like, in bike counts and stuff like that. So It's really interesting, like, to hear it from both perspectives, because I can see it working for both, and for me, I mean, it's not, it's not something I would necessarily identify. I'm just like everybody else. I ride a bike, but because it's a weird mix, because even though I am undocumented, uh, I do have a louder voice than most other folks who are just like day laborers or just riding their bike out of necessity, because I am, I guess, for lack of a better term, I am younger. I am more tech savvy. I am college educated. So I put myself in these organizing spaces to actually be counted, and not represent, but kind of be there as one of the folks who necessarily will be overlooked if there's like a meeting for bike lanes or there's some sort of count going on. So I take it upon myself to, like, here in Los Angeles with the Los Angeles Bicycle Coalition, I participate in a lot of events they have, and bike counts and rides and everything. So, I kind of, in a way, I kind of fight that term by being more out there and sharing my story and my experiences of working with day laborers. Telling stories about bicycle co-ops and having workshops and all these kind of issues that happen. So it's like a little push and pull there.
Great. Yeah, and I think when I first came across the term, I was also living and doing bike advocacy in Los Angeles, and I read about it in an issue of Bicycling magazine that I think was from early 2005, and the LA writer Dan Capel wrote a piece talking about, like, hey, there's all these other people using bikes, and they are not necessarily the same as me and my friends who are doing, kind of weekend warrior style recreational cycling. And so I'd be interested to hear how others first came across the term, but that was where I first heard it, and then I started seeing it kind of used in some advocacy reports too, because it had a kind of utility, as Eric was saying. When you first hear the term, it kind of it describes something that maybe we didn't have a term for before, but there's also a lot of issues with it. So anyway, on to Doe. What do you think?
Well, I definitely agree that on kind of like the initial hearing of this term, it does seem to have some sort of utility, but definitely from a very privileged perspective. As Naja mentioned, it's a very dehumanizing term. And when I started really thinking about it a little bit more, it's really kind of trying to separate bicyclists into us and them. And so us as the good cyclists and them as the bad cyclists who are invisible. And so, for me, it's a term that's defining certain segments of the population of cyclists from a privileged perspective rather than from the experience of the cyclists themselves. And it really highlights this problem where there's this kind of privileging of expert knowledge and devaluing of community knowledge. And so this really reinforces this discourse that we really want a certain type of cyclist, and that it's based on wealth and income and class and race, and it's really kind of constructing these hierarchies where prevent cyclists from coming together and creating boundaries where they shouldn't exist. And so I'm very uncomfortable with this term, and I think the other major thing that I'm uncomfortable about is that invisible cyclist doesn't describe how these cyclists are also made visible through societal aggressive policing, racial profiling that happens on the streets. So I actually argue that these cyclists are actually very highly visible, but for very negative reasons. And so it's describing invisibility for the benefits of cycling while ascribing this hidden visibility of how we basically discipline them in our spaces.
That's great. So you're saying that the term invisible cyclist implies that there's a visible or normal cyclist, and so it's reproducing the idea that there's some kind of normal against which we then say that this other population is not normal. And also, I like what you're bringing up with the hidden visible, where people are experiencing more targeted enforcement and the usual police discrimination issues that are suffered by communities of color. All right, Steve?
Great, wonderful points all the way around. I should say I was really excited when Adonia came to me with this idea. I didn't mention in my introduction that my colleague Julian Adjamin and I started this blog a couple of years ago called Invisible Cyclist, and maybe I'll give a little bit of background on that as I answer the question now. But yeah, I wanted to say that I was excited when Adonia came to me because I'm completely open to finding alternatives, moving beyond, strategizing what the next phase of the movement should look like, so that we have, more empowering terminology. But what I wanted to share is that when Julie and I kind of came upon this idea to begin blogging about what we were calling Invisible Cyclist, borrowing from the article that Adonia mentioned, I was looking at bicycle advocacy, mainstream bicycle advocacy organizations, and seeing that there were clearly certain people missing. And then I was looking at my background is in environmental sociology, so I had some familiarity with the environmental justice movement and sort of an arm of that, or maybe it's its own movement. You could say the transportation justice movement. LA in particular had a very powerful movement, the bus riders union success story. And what I was noticing is that there was absolutely no discussion of bicycling among the transportation justice movement organizations. And similarly, or in parallel, in the bike advocacy organizations, there was no discussion of the bicycle as a just form of transportation for people who are excluded in other ways from other forms of transportation. So we wanted to begin to try to create dialogue around that, and we just decided to use this concept of the invisible cyclist. Now, things have evolved, and my thinking on it has changed. And I wanted to point out that our tagline on that blog is "All cyclists are invisible, some more than others." And I'll sort of like take a risk here and be potentially slightly controversial in saying that I think for most white middle-class cyclists who become active bike advocates, they get mobilized by the feeling of invisibility that comes from riding a bike. And what I mean there is the invisibility to cars, quite specifically. And then maybe more broadly and abstractly, invisibility as a sort of stakeholder or interest group, a bicyclist, the bicycling identity. So I think this is a feeling that anyone with privileged social statuses, like being white and male, has likely never felt, right? I mean, that's the nature of privilege, is that your status is most dominant, so you don't feel invisible. So I think there's something maybe to be explored there in the way that at least white males that come into the movement do so because of having, for the first time in their lives, perhaps, experienced a certain type of invisibility. So there's nothing wrong with getting mobilized in that way. I think, except for that, it can make this, let's say, hypothetical white male bike advocate blind to the other type of invisible cyclist, if you will, right? The ones that we've been talking about, those whose mode is not a choice but a necessity, who may not speak the language, either the language of the infrastructure itself or the language that policy and decisions are made in, who may have work, family, and other requirements that make his or her movement about the city by bike more or less invisible, even to those that we ostensibly are calling bike advocates. So that if there's any utility to using the term to be able to kind of flesh out some of those relationships, I would love to explore that. I guess I feel like maybe piggybacking on Doe's comments, that rather than a term that creates a division within the movement, we need a term that can unite, so that there's a sense that we're all in this together, and we move forward on that basis.
Great. Yeah, I was kind of toying with the term indivisible cyclists earlier. I don't know if that maybe doesn't have a perfect ring to it, but I totally agree. Yeah, a term that unites rather than divides is a great way to move forward. Well, do you guys have any responses to each other just from those kind of overviews?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think from my experiences and from organizing and being in both like academic spaces and on the ground and talking to community members, there's always like a bit of miscommunication between both sides. I mean, and then it can't be helped. When folks are doing the research or doing books or whatever, they have to use that institutional language. When we're out in the street and we're just organizing, we're just talking about issues that we don't call them anything. That's just everyday life. So, for me, it's been an ongoing relationship like that where, I'm very mindful of what language I use in what spaces, and sometimes I double dip. Like I'll bring in language from one space to another to help, whoever it is I'm talking to kind of like engage and be more open, and then also talk about it in a more broader context. Because even though both spaces are working with each other, sometimes there's either by like just by happenstance or something, both spaces are divided, and it's like them and us and there over here. So yeah.
Well, yeah, I would say that one of the major reasons why I started to kind of think maybe we should have more of a dialogue about this term was that I thought that the utility of the term in a kind of institutional setting, like Eric's saying, where it's a way to describe these. We're assuming people are biking out of economic necessity, usually men of color, riding bikes that seem like they got just the cheapest bike they could, and they're maybe riding on the sidewalk, not in the street. That the term invisible cyclist was a way to refer to that population and thus bring that population in some ways into an institutional setting like a bike advocacy organization or talking about bike planning. But I started to wonder if maybe in using that term and myself being a bike advocate and a person of color, if maybe I was implying that there was some sort of substantive difference between me and these other people who I think need to be represented. And I started to kind of feel like maybe that was a form of discrimination that I was enacting by saying, oh, well, I'm not one of those invisible cyclists, but I care about them. And starting to go, well, maybe I am one of those invisible cyclists. I'm certainly second generation, my family would have been invisible cyclists. My dad is an immigrant from Mexico. So for me, yeah, really starting to question the term came from kind of looking at my own background and identity and going, gosh, what is it that separates me from this other population? And really crucially, is there some way in which, if we keep kind of referring to this group as invisible cyclists, are we making those of us who now kind of cross over between uh, different communities and are coming into bike advocacy and planning professional spaces, are we making ourselves invisible, and are we making our insights invisible? So I kind of started to wonder about that. Like, at what point do we try to work within kind of the methods or the measures that are already established for doing something like promoting bicycling or expanding bicycling, and at what point do we say, this just doesn't really fit with the experiences that we have and the experiences of the people that we know, so how do we change that? So yeah.
I just wanted to throw out, this is Steve Zavostovsky. I wanted to throw out there, since I'm kind of seeing some stuff pop up on Twitter, the possibility we take this even further and look for an alternative to calling us or the movement cyclists or bicyclists at all. Right? Many people, you've seen the work in the Netherlands on how your typical person on a bicycle doesn't consider themselves a bicyclist. It's just a choice of transportation. People on buses don't consider themselves busists, and so is there a way that we can move beyond that term altogether? Sort of build a coalition that brings in, I don't know, the public health community, labor, immigration, other movements, and we talk about livability and equity and justice more broadly rather than just for bicyclists.
This is Doe. Steve, I think that's a really interesting point, I think it kind of goes back to this description of invisible cyclists as those who bike out of economic necessity, and I actually really have trouble with that because I think everyone is multimodal, and everybody has a suite of choices, even if the choices aren't very good. And you make choices based on your lived experience in the place, on what works in that day, what works in that moment, and those circumstances change over time. And so I know for myself, my commuting modes have changed based on place, based on those around me, based on my job. And partly also, those choices are also constrained in a lot of ways, but we can also argue that about wealthy people who live in rich enclaves in like Beverly Hills and up in remote hills where it's really impossible to get around to the daily needs of life without driving. Yet we don't really consider them driving out of necessity in the same ways that we might argue that these invisible cyclists are bicycling out of economic necessity. And so at some level, there's a certain amount of choice involved, and saying someone doesn't have a choice is also, in a very way, robbing them of their agency over they have in life, and also kind of further moves them away from us. And so, I like what you're trying to do here, and trying to think of it as more of like this is part of the complete community of life and how we experience a place, and not just that we're not all just cyclists, we're not just all pedestrians, but we do things in a multiplicity of ways.
Yeah, that choice, the choice model for understanding transportation is something that has been challenged, I think, from a number of quarters. Doe and I participated recently in a Congress for the New Urbanism Transportation and Equity Summit held up in New York City, and we got to hear about the research of Stephanie Pollock at Northeastern University, who has been working on equity issues in looking at how to make sure that transit-rich communities remain diverse. And she really hammered home the point of, we need to get past terms like transit dependent and reducing people to this kind of dehumanized status of, oh, they don't have a choice, and recognizing that people we all have choices, and as Doe said, sometimes we just don't have great choices, but we're making the best choices often for the situations that we have. But that choice, that idea of choice, is I think a good example of the kind of institutional language that is very much a part of working in any kind of transportation field. And so if we're seeing that it doesn't really describe or it doesn't fully encompass the needs of the populations we're talking about, what are some alternative terms or ways to describe those choices?
I mean, and this is Eric. I think more than anything, from my experiences being in other movement and spaces, it's just something that's going to keep happening organically. And I think from like the conversation we're having right now, it's just there's some growing pains, because I know in the spaces I've been in, we started out calling ourselves one thing and identifying in one way, and then a few years later we're like completely on the opposite end of that. So, I mean, even though it's not the best term to use for whatever reason, I think it's an appropriate term to just keep going, and then it'll eventually lead to something better, and then something where everybody can kind of relate to it and feel more comfortable using, rather than what we're stuck with right now.
Yeah, and I think my concern would be that I totally agree, Eric, but my concern would be that as that unfolds and evolves, that I don't know, labels get attached and identities formed that prevent more of a unified movement. So that if we look at the example, I think in the environmental justice movement, this was over 20 years ago now that people began to point out that people of color were bearing the brunt of all the environmental bads that we were creating in our industrial society. And they were also pointing out that the mainstream environmental groups were run by all white people and focusing mostly on saving forests and species. And the movement sort of began to acknowledge that this was an issue. But 20 years later, a study came out recently, and the leadership of the mainstream environmental movements is still very white. So that they kind of tacked on environmental justice like almost as like a campaign issue. Many organizations did, but they didn't really integrate it or embrace it or find ways to kind of create more solidarity. So I guess I don't know what the answer is, but I would love to see the bike advocacy movement avoid that same kind of mistake.
And I think that would follow more on us, the ones that are in these spaces, to like you were mentioning earlier, just hold ourselves accountable in a way where we continue having these conversations instead of just like pointing fingers and like, you know, just talking trash back and forth.
So one thing that's come up is you being counted, and Steve brought up the great point that's made on the Invisible Cyclist blog that all cyclists are invisible, some more than others, and there has been a real push in the last few years to try and demonstrate how many bicycle users there already are using public streets as a way to make sure that we're actually accounted for in terms of transportation planning, transportation funding. So this issue of being counted is a general one for all bicycle users at this point in time. But do you guys think that there's something especially important or different about counting the population that we've referred to as invisible cyclists?
I think the way we count cyclists is strange. We only focus on commuter counts because that's when we know the largest number of cyclists will be in a specific space and time. And I'm saying this as a person who organizes commuter counts. To then tie counting to funding for infrastructure or implementation of programs just continues to put people in a disadvantaged state. I feel like I'm seeing a lot of people on Twitter talk about how we should stop using the term cyclist because we need to focus on people moving from place to place. If we're going to install our infrastructure based on where there's only cyclists, we're going to limit the number of cyclists. If we're thinking about counting, we need to think about where do people want to go, how do people want to move. We can't really plan for today if our goals are to change the future. That's just my view on how counting can really hold us back if we get so focused on the numbers of where people are now and where should we install our infrastructure today to make sure that then makes the people who are biking now the safest without focusing on those who might consider biking tomorrow.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Naja, that there's this bias for the new bicyclists, right? The interested but concerned, to use that terminology. So I completely agree with what you just said.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and also to the getting beyond the term cyclist issue, that I'm pretty sure was a central concern for choosing the names for a couple of the projects that we have represented on the webinar today. Biking Public Project, I know that the folks who came up with that name were intentionally avoiding labeling it with cyclist, and Multicultural Communities for Mobility, as Eric mentioned, started as a campaign with Latino cyclists in LA and then expanded to have more of a broader focus on transportation. So I think that there are some good examples out there now of groups that are working beyond the term cyclist, but it's also a great question to keep open, and as more folks become familiar with the reasons why we would want to get beyond the term cyclist. You know, if any of you want to kind of articulate that, that'd be great to hear.
Well, I definitely agree with both Steve and Naja, and I think this also speaks to the need to build an inclusive bicycling advocacy planning movement. Because when you read the methodology for how the logic involved in how we count and where we count, it's usually done from a particular perspective, and if those perspectives of diverse communities are not involved in that process of how we count, then we're going to count the things that build and reinforce privilege. And so, I mean, I think we have to build and encourage more inclusivity in those kind of processes.
And I mean, so what are some good ideas for inclusion of more types of bicycle users in bike advocacy and planning that that don't rely on counting. Because one of the critiques that's often made of bicycle counts is that we don't get demographic information. There's the sighting issues, there's the time of day issues, there's the counting from a particular perspective, and then there's the we don't we don't really flesh out, the counts don't flesh out for us who it is that's using roads and what they think about it. So what are some good ideas you guys have encountered for including more factors or more realities in advocacy and planning beyond counting?
This is Eric. I think one of the things that I've seen work, and it's a mixed bag sometimes in terms of like what kind of results we get, is pretty much just taking the work or like whatever needs to be done, the planning, the issue, to folks themselves. MCM in the beginning when they were City of Lights, they didn't rely on like folks coming to meetings or hosting or anything. They went directly to the day labor side, to the workers themselves, where the corners where they were at. They took the issue to them, and kind of like from there took information as it was needed, as where it was available. So more than anything, that's what I've seen work. Like we take it to folks, and then over the years I've seen it too, like kind of making it more inclusive, and also more fun. That's the thing that's always bringing in more folks into like bike rides and events and stuff that we're planning out while we're working on like serious issues or whatever it is. We also incorporate that element of fun where we're just hanging out and we're getting to know each other and we're building these movements while at the same time, still working on the stuff that we need to be working on.
That's a great point, Eric. This is Steve Zatostowski again. Some of the activists that I work with and talk with in the San Francisco area emphasize how you got to make things fun. It can be a downer when it's all about the politics and the power. And I've noticed on Twitter some folks that I follow have been talking a lot about in San Jose right now, where even the mainstream movement is really being shaped by a much more diverse voice and audience, so that you have like the San Jose Bike Party, which is got this really great cultural flair that's very different than a bike party or critical mass or other kind of event that's more typically mainstream. So yeah, I would definitely get behind that. Any way we can make stuff fun, and when it's fun, it brings people together.
I think I also wonder what we are including people in, and I definitely agree with the point about making things fun. I think about this as from the viewpoint of a planner who's, I'm tasked with figuring out where that bike lane needs to go or where that bike rack needs to go. And I think that the biggest tool people have is really engaging and talking to people who live in these communities. And I think one of the biggest struggles is that you end up with people like me who don't necessarily enjoy talking to others, right? Like I went to MIT, that's known for being nerdy. We're known for hiding in our dorm rooms. And so how do we overcome that barrier that exists clearly culturally between the communities we're planning for and the people who are the planners, right? I have personally experienced many times going to public meetings, people would talk to me specifically because I was an African American woman. How am I supposed to challenge that if all of the other planners are white? If they're not aware of this reality, if they're not aware of that basic barrier to people bringing their concerns, I don't know what to do about that. And I think that's something that we really have to think about when we talk about inclusion, is other ways to consider bridging these gaps. Because I'm all for community bike rides and these other events, but a lot of what we are talking about with advocacy is figuring out how to create safe spaces and safe streets for people, and we can't solve that simply with group rides.
I think that's such a great point, Naja, and really understanding how the like Eric and Steve were saying, like how to make this fun, but also really accessible. Oftentimes we have these kind of like community or open meetings, and they're really done in a way that is totally inaccessible, and it reeks of power differentials. It can be really intimidating for people who are not well versed in the language that's being used to participate and feel like they have knowledge that is valuable. So, I mean, I think that it requires a lot of reflexivity on part of those who do the planning and the advocacy of trying to engage in ways that are accessible, make sense, and really tries to have people be able to give knowledge in a way that they can and know and are comfortable with, and not just in the ways that we as experts are comfortable with.
Yeah, and this is Eric. One of the things that I found that I think really works a lot, and then because this is one of the few ways I've been able to like be able to be in these like urban spaces and like academic spaces, whether it's for cycling or immigration reform or for anything, is that one of my biggest learning tools is popular education, and that's something that we still use when we do bike mechanics, bike safety, when we're talking about policy, when we're talking about bike lanes, whatever it is. We kind of bring it in the popular education focus because I mean we work with a lot of diverse folks. We work with folks that are my peers who are college educated, who are regular cyclists, and they choose to be on a bike. While we talk to other folks who are day laborers, who might not have an education at all, might be borderline illiterate. So we always have to like find a way to like make sure that everybody that's in the space, whether they're monolingual or bilingual, depending on their education level, their understanding of things, to incorporate all of that and mix it in together into something that'll work. And for me, popular education has always been one of those tools that work.
It sounds to me like what we're getting at is this really interesting question about how to integrate, how the movement can strategize to better integrate um, building what Adonia calls the human infrastructure versus the physical infrastructure, the separated bike lanes and the dedicated signals and all those things. And too much focus on one or the other is probably not good for the movement. But the barriers, it sounds like to me, what Naja was saying, are that the formal planning processes and the ways that we count that are linked to funding and so on are, create a barrier. So we've got to figure out how to overcome that barrier, and maybe part of that is through the building of the human infrastructure, the fun events. People maybe can gain a sense of maybe some of the terminology, and then they might be more comfortable to go into a meeting and talk using some of that terminology. I'm not sure. I'm just kind of thinking out loud on this, but I wanted to throw that out there and see what your thoughts are. Is this kind of what we're getting at? Is like this tension or how to strike the balance between working on the human infrastructure, the culture, and then the built infrastructure.
And I think too, one of the questions that I've been able to start to ask. Oh, I'll just be real quick. The question of, we already have in our public planning and decision-making processes, there's a considerable amount of community engagement that's just mandated by law, but those processes aren't necessarily as accessible as the kind of grassroots bike community spaces that a lot of people have built around the country. So we've been talking about, within the league here, we've been talking about how can we connect the fun, the socializing side of just on the ground, people spending time together on bikes, with these existing community engagement elements in planning. And one of the people who I really look to as a thought partner in this, who I think is listening, so maybe her ears are going to start burning like crazy, is Jessica Roberts, who is a principal with Alta Planning and Design in Portland. So yeah, just thinking about how we can kind of build that human infrastructure between just the people who are really, they've got their ear to the ground, they're a part of these communities, and then the people who are the community engagement professionals in the planning world. How can we bridge across those conversations as well? All right, I'll shut up now. Naja, go.
I was just going to say, I hear when I'm in a room full of planners. I frequently hear people say, well, I don't know how to talk to certain people, or I don't know where to find these people. And like, if you're planning for a community, you know, you can use whatever mode of transit you choose and get to that community, and there will be people there that you can speak to. If you need to bring an interpreter, do so. There are many, many ways to communicate, but I think that what you're saying about bridging this gap between, you know, the fun and the planners is really important, and I think it's something that's really hard because people I know who've made the transition from working in community, having their ear on the ground, being very involved, and then suddenly spending 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. working on plans and infrastructure and so on, it's then hard just as a person to put that mental energy outside of work hours to continue to talk about bicycling and all of the things that are wrong with what's currently going on. And I feel like we have to figure out how we can all connect as people and understand, you know, the things that a professional might be dealing with, of just like, I have this job, but then I also need to maintain my personal life, so maybe then I can't spend all this time at these community events. But at the same time, it's still my responsibility as a professional to be there, to speak in terms that people can actually understand rather than using all the jargon. Just all of these things that, for me, just feel like, I mean, just common sense of like, you have to learn how to connect with people, but at the same time, people need to respect you as a person.
So one thing that I guess would be a slight transition would be kind of getting back to the question of environmental justice or bike justice. I started thinking with the term bike justice a few years ago when I was living in Seattle, and I started to wonder if maybe we could gain something by going and asking people who are community leaders in the most diverse part of the city, Rainier Valley, asking folks who ran community-based organizations, who were advocates for their communities, asking them about bicycling. And so I got some support from local bike groups to go and do some interviews, and it was really illuminating for me because I had a hunch that I was going to hear some pretty negative things, and I did. But it was also really helpful to be aware that, you know, for me, I've been operating for years with this idea that bicycling is a social justice issue, that, you know, access to safe streets is something that everybody deserves, and the fact that some cyclists are more vulnerable than others, in particular cyclists of color, are disproportionately killed. They're disproportionately represented in bicycle fatalities. You know, for me, this was a justice issue. But a lot of other folks who are very at home in the social justice world or in the environmental justice world don't see bicycling that way, as Steve mentioned. So I wonder if we could talk a little bit about that, and what if that just seems contradictory to you guys, or if you've heard that in your experience, and ways forward.
I want to give you a really quick example, and I'd love to hear other people's thoughts. When I first raised this question with a friend here in the Bay Area who works for an environmental justice organization, you know, why don't you guys work on bicycle transportation issues? And what she told me is that most of the constituents of her organization live in parts of the city, or they also deal with communities out in the Central Valley that have extraordinarily poor air quality. And she said that they've actually talked about it within the organization and feel like it would be putting people at risk by encouraging them to be on bicycles when the air quality is so bad. And that was a moment where I had to sort of check my privilege and realize, like, wow, here I am thinking that, like, we just need to get everybody on bikes. And the reality is that might not be the best solution for everybody. I'll stop there.
I think what you just said is a really, really important point for everyone involved in this work. I just struggle sometimes with feeling like I'm prioritizing other people's problems. And like you said, if there's poor air quality, how can we then encourage people to get on bicycles if we know they're suddenly going to be inhaling air that's really dangerous for them?
I mean, I totally agree with you guys. It's such a great point that, I mean, this is where we have to really reach out and understand the community knowledge. Like, you know, bicycling justice is not just limited to infrastructure. It's not just limited to the social infrastructure or human infrastructure of cycling, but into all these other things. The air quality, aggressive policing. It's related to income inequality and access to affordable housing. It's all part of a cohesive community, and it's not, and we shouldn't treat it as separate from all these things. And I think that's a really good point that you bring up, Steve.
Well, so it sounds like in terms of working from that awareness that bicycling is something that happens not separate from all these other issues, but in the same spaces where all this other stuff is happening. Maybe the best thing we can do to respect that as advocates and to be more effective in communities where people don't really necessarily have bikes top of mind. Even if they ride bikes occasionally, it's not something they are thinking about going out and advocating for. The more we can do to contextualize why we think bicycling is a good option for people to have, instead of assuming that there's a particular image that everybody shares of bicycling and that it's a positive image. And I think that that actually gets to one of the limitations with the term cyclist itself is, what is that referring to? And we are struggling in this country right now with the reality that there's a particular kind of lifestyle imaging associated with bicycling that is also associated with particular kinds of neighborhood change, urban redevelopment, gentrification, and that's very confusing for those of us who see bicycling actually as a sort of equalizing tool. And so thinking about finding out, asking people what they have in mind when we say something like cyclist or bicycling is a good starting point to actually being able to contextualize our vision of cycling within their worldview in a way that makes sense, and then actually coming to a shared understanding of what bicycling can and should mean. So we are getting close to 2 o'clock now, and a couple of things that I would like to cover before we wrap up. One is just asking anybody who's listening and my speakers today if you have in mind other kinds of discussions like this, or terms, or trends that are related to these kinds of equity, diversity, and inclusion issues in bicycling, shoot me an email. I'm adonia@bikeleague.org, or Urban Adonia on Twitter, and we'd like to keep the conversation going. I think this has been a good starting point. But I also wanted to mention that Steve is the co-editor of a new book that came out recently. Steve and Julian Aguiman published a book called Incomplete Streets, Processes, Practices, and Possibilities. And Steve, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the book and the conversations you're hoping to contribute to with it.
Sure. Our aim with the book was to challenge, I think, in a constructive way, hopefully, the almost like rise to stardom of the Complete Streets movement, just being embraced by planners and even public health professionals and all kinds of corners of society as this be all and end all that's going to make cities more livable and bikeable and walkable. And what we wanted to do is point out that the approach taken by urban planners is a very sort of technical engineering type approach. That a complete street means that you've got curb cutouts and you've got separated bike lanes and you've got all these sort of technical aspects. And we wanted to point out that streets are actually symbolic social spaces, and we need to have a more sort of inclusive approach to how we design streets. That it won't actually be complete; they'll be incomplete unless we factor in that all those the mode types that planners talk about, the transit user, the motorist, the pedestrian, the bicyclist, all those labels strip away from people the complexity of their identities and their backgrounds and their choices, the things we've been talking about. So Incomplete Streets was a way to bring together people who are, I think, kind of sharing that idea and working in their own ways in different cities around the country, looking at these issues. How is there sort of a co-optation? My particular interest was this idea that there's a co-optation of sustainability by city leaders and urban planners to say, oh, well, we're going to improve bikeability to address the urban sustainability issue, but you're not really addressing sustainability when you leave out the social and equity part of the definition of sustainability. So kind of trying to get the dialogue going around how we can be more true to the idea of sustainability as being about equity, economics, and environment, and then also think about what an actual complete street would look like, not just one that serves different mode users, but one that welcomes and is inclusive to people of various backgrounds. And Joe is one of the chapter authors, and he might want to add another thought or two about the project or his chapter.
Oh, thanks, Steve. The project was really great. There's a lot of really interesting chapters in there, and at least the one I wrote was about how we understand responsibility in the street, in terms of the damage that happens from car accidents and why we name them car accidents, and how that responsibility for what happens in the street becomes erased, and how that irresponsibility gets shifted onto other users of the streets, and how this kind of creates hierarchies and divisions amongst people who should really have solidarity around, working towards a more complete street. So, so if you want to, hear a little more about responsibility and or a conception of it, that's what my chapter is about.
Well, great. So yeah, Incomplete Streets is out of the Rutledge Equity, Justice, and the Sustainable City series. So thanks, guys, for participating in this discussion today. Any last words on the subject, Eric, Naja?
I mean, just for folks to be, keep in mind that we all come from different spaces, we all have different identities, and it's easy to get wrapped up in trying to, accommodate everybody in terms of like, am I making this place inclusive? Trying to fit in as many people as we can. But I think, from my experiences, it's you can only do so much, and you have to rely on the help from others. And at the end of the day, it really just comes down to if you build it, they will come. So whatever kind of space you're kind of create, while it may take some time to build, if we keep at it, eventually we'll get that return of like folks coming into it and contributing to it and adding to it at the same time.
I just want to echo what Eric said. I feel like a lot of.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was saying a lot of what I see, I think, is really beautiful. Of the spaces becoming bigger rather than becoming smaller, and becoming a lot more inclusive. And as someone said earlier, we're going through growing pains. So as more people are invited to participate in the conversation, we're going to have a lot of ideas coming through. And what works for one group of people might not necessarily work for another.
Great. Well, I've been joined today by Steve Zavistosky, Do Lee, Eric Huerta, and Naja Shakir talking about the term invisible cyclist and wondering if we're ready to move beyond that and look more for terminology that unites different types of bicycle users rather than imagining that different groups have different needs, because that puts us in a space where then some cyclists' needs might be seen as more important than others. So sounds to me like everybody, the work that they're doing focuses on how we can get beyond that kind of separated thinking and into these shared spaces that are built to encourage more participation from everyone. So thanks so much for being a part of the discussion today, folks.
Thank you, Donia, for organizing this.
Thanks.
All right. Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.